A black young girl was humiliated in court. Years later, she wrote the law that changed everything. This might be the best story you'll hear today. Enjoy it. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across the sterile courthouse hallway. 11-year-old Grace Daniels sat alone on a wooden bench, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap, fingers intertwined like a prayer. Her navy blue dress, the only one she owned, was pressed carefully despite its frayed hem, and her black Mary, Jane shoes polished with petroleum jelly, reflected the cold linoleum beneath her feet. The oversized manila folder beside her contained math worksheets covered in her careful handwriting equations that danced across the pages like poetry only she could understand. Every few seconds her dark eyes would dart toward the heavy oak, her doors of courtroom 3B, where her fate was being decided by people who had never bothered to truly see her. The trouble had begun 3 weeks earlier, when Mrs. Patricia Whitmore, principal of Lincoln Elementary School, discovered Grace helping her classmates with advanced mathematics during lunch. What should have been celebrated as kindness became weaponized as fraud. Grace had been solving calculus problems for fun, sharing her love of numbers with struggling peers, but Mrs. Whitmore saw only a threat to the established order. A black girl from the projects couldn't possibly understand mathematics at a university level. It had to be cheating, she reasoned. The accusations came swift and merciless: academic fraud, system manipulation, theft of educational materials. Within days, Grace found herself facing juvenile court, her world crumbling like equations without solutions. The supporting characters in Grace's nightmare began to emerge like dark figures in a twisted play. Detective Raymond Cooper, called to the school by Mrs. Whitmore, arrived, with handcuffs sized for adults, his face set in grim determination as he processed what he believed was a clear case of academic misconduct. Grace's homeroom teacher, Miss Sarah Chen, watched helplessly from the sidelines, her protestations about Grace's genuine brilliance falling on deaf ears. Even Grace's elderly grandmother, Dorothy Daniels, who had raised her since birth, found herself questioned and scrutinized her credibility, undermined by caseworkers who saw only poverty and assumed neglect. The system that should have protected Grace instead became her prosecutor, each adult failing her in increasingly devastating ways. As the preliminary hearings progressed, Grace's situation deteriorated rapidly. Child Protective Services opened an investigation into her home life, questioning how a child from such circumstances could excel academically without outside intervention. Mrs. Whitmore presented her case with surgical precision, painting Grace as a manipulative child who had somehow gained access to restricted educational materials. The evidence seemed overwhelming to those who refused to believe in Grace's natural ability. Advanced worksheets in her backpack, university-level textbooks, checked out under her library card, and testimony from intimidated classmates who admitted she had helped them with assignments. Grace's attempts to explain her passion for mathematics were dismissed as rehearsed lies, her genuine love for numbers twisted into criminal intent. The weight of institutional disbelief pressed down on her small shoulders like a physical force, threatening to crush the very spirit that made her extraordinary. But it was the courtroom itself that delivered the cruelest blow. Judge William Morrison, a man who had spent 30 years on the bench without ever questioning his own biases, looked at Grace and saw only what his prejudices allowed. He listened to Mrs. Whitmore's testimony with nodding approval, watched the prosecution present their case with growing satisfaction, and dismissed Grace's quiet explanations with barely concealed disdain. When the public defender assigned to her case, overworked and overwhelmed, suggested that Grace's intelligence might be genuine, Judge Morrison's response was swift and brutal. "I've seen enough children from broken homes try to game the system," he declared, his words cutting through the courtroom like broken glass. "This child needs structure, not special treatment." The gavel fell with the finality of a prison door slamming shut, and Grace felt something inside her crack that would never fully heal. What would happen next would either destroy her completely or forge her into something unbreakable. The formal sentencing hearing arrived like a storm Grace had been watching approach for weeks. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with the bearing of a man convinced of his own righteousness, his black robes flowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. Grace sat at the defendant's table, her back straight. Despite the trembling in her hands, her eyes fixed on a point just above the judge's head, where she could see dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeam. The courtroom gallery was filled with curious onlookers drawn by the unusual case of an 11-year-old facing academic fraud, charges their whispered conversations, creating a buzz of judgment that seemed to surround Grace like a swarm of insects. When Judge Morrison finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, each word carefully chosen to demonstrate his power over this small, vulnerable child who dared to challenge the natural order of things. But as Grace listened to his pronouncement, 6 months in juvenile detention, followed by supervised probation and mandatory tutoring to address her behavioral issues, she felt something unexpected stirring within her chest. It wasn't despair, though, that lived there too. It wasn't fear, though, that coursed through her veins like ice water. It was rage, pure and clean, and focused, the kind of anger that could either consume a person or fuel them for a lifetime. What Judge Morrison didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this moment would become the foundation stone of everything Grace would build in the years to come. The turning point came not in the courtroom, but in the detention center's makeshift classroom 3 weeks later. Dr. Marcus Thompson, a mathematics professor from nearby Northwestern University, had read about Grace's case in the Chicago Tribune and felt compelled to investigate. What he found when he met Grace was nothing short of extraordinary. A young girl who could visualize mathematical relationships in ways that graduate students struggled to comprehend, who saw patterns and connections that had taken him decades to understand. When he presented her with a complex calculus problem that would challenge his advanced students, Grace solved it in her head while he was still writing it on the board. The revelation hit him like lightning. This child wasn't just gifted, she was potentially one of the most mathematically talented minds he had ever encountered. Dr. Thompson immediately began making phone calls, reaching out to colleagues, journalists, and legal advocates who might be able to help. Within days, Grace's story began to spread through academic circles like wildfire, each mathematician who met her walking away amazed and outraged by the injustice she had suffered. The wheels of justice, when properly motivated, could move with surprising speed. Dr. Thompson's intervention brought media attention that Judge Morrison and Mrs. Whitmore had never anticipated, suddenly exposing their actions to public scrutiny. Prominent mathematicians began writing letters of support, child advocacy groups took up Grace's cause, and investigative journalists started digging into the school's handling of the case. Grace found herself at the center of a growing storm of attention. But instead of cowering under the spotlight, she began to find her voice. When reporters asked her about her treatment, she spoke with quiet dignity about the importance of believing in children who were different, about the damage done when potential was mistaken for deception. Her words, delivered with a poise that seemed impossible for someone so young, began to resonate far beyond Chicago. The case that was meant to silence her was instead amplifying her voice, transforming a personal tragedy into a platform for change. As Grace's story gained national attention, the personal relationships in her life began to deepen and evolve in unexpected ways. Dr. Thompson became more than just an advocate. He became a mentor and father figure, filling a void that had existed since her father's death when she was 7. Her grandmother Dorothy, initially bewildered by the attention, found herself thrust into the role of fierce protector, giving interviews where her pride in Grace's intelligence shone through every word. Even Miss Chen, Grace's former teacher, found the courage to speak publicly about what she had witnessed, her testimony, helping to expose the racial bias that had driven the school's accusations. These relationships became Grace's anchor during the tumultuous months that followed, providing her with the emotional support she needed to weather the continuing legal battles and media scrutiny. But perhaps most importantly, Grace began to connect with other children who had been failed by similar systems, recognizing that her experience, while devastating, was far from unique. The emotional toll of her ordeal continued to mount, even as external support grew around Grace. Nightmares plagued her sleep, filled with images of courtrooms and handcuffs, and the sound of Judge Morrison's gavel. She struggled with feelings of shame and self-doubt, wondering if perhaps the adults were right, if she really was somehow wrong to be different. The detention center had left its mark on her psyche, the memory of being treated like a criminal for the crime of being gifted eating away at her confidence. Yet through it all, Grace clung to her love of mathematics, like a lifeline, finding solace in the pure logic of numbers and equations that didn't judge her by the color of her skin or the circumstances of her birth. Dr. Thompson recognized the signs of trauma and arranged for Grace to receive counseling, helping her to process not just what had happened to her, but what it meant for her future. It was during these sessions that Grace first began to articulate her growing determination to ensure that no other child would suffer as she had. The pain of her experience was transforming into purpose, her trauma alchemizing into a driving need for justice that would define the rest of her life. The moment of greatest tension arrived on a gray October morning when the Illinois State Board of Education announced their decision regarding Grace's case. The board had been investigating Lincoln Elementary School's handling of the situation for months, reviewing policies and procedures, while Grace's legal team fought to have all charges dropped. Grace sat in the conference room at the state building, surrounded by lawyers and advocates and journalists, her hands folded in her lap as officials read their findings. The school district was found to have violated multiple policies in their treatment of Grace. Mrs. Whitmore was placed on administrative leave, pending further investigation, and all academic fraud charges were officially dismissed. But the moment that would live forever in Grace's memory came when the board chairwoman looked directly at her and said, "We failed you, Miss Daniels. The system that should have celebrated your gifts instead tried to punish you for them. We are profoundly sorry." For the first time since the ordeal began, Grace allowed herself to cry. Not tears of shame or fear, but tears of vindication and relief. She had been heard. She had been believed. She had survived. The resolution of Grace's case brought justice, but it also brought clarity about the work that still needed to be done. As the legal proceedings concluded and media attention began to fade, Grace found herself at a crossroads. She could return to her old life, try to move forward, and forget the trauma she had endured, or she could use her experience as fuel for something larger. The choice, when it came, felt inevitable. With Dr. Thompson's guidance and her grandmother's blessing, Grace threw herself into her education, with renewed purpose, excelling not just in mathematics, but in history, civics, and eventually law. She became a voracious reader of legal cases, particularly those involving children's rights and educational equity. Mrs. Whitmore's dismissal from the school district and Judge Morrison's early retirement felt like personal victories. But Grace understood that individual accountability was just the beginning. The systems that had failed her were still in place, still ready to fail the next child who didn't fit the expected mold. Her mission became clear. She would change those systems from the inside, armed with both her intellectual gifts and her lived experience of injustice. Years passed like pages turning in a book Grace was writing with her life. She graduated high school at 15, earned her bachelor's degree at 18, and entered law school at Northwestern University, the same institution where Dr. Thompson had taught before becoming her mentor. Throughout her education, Grace never forgot the 11-year-old girl who had been handcuffed for being too smart, too different, too black for the comfort of those in power. She interned with civil rights organizations, wrote papers on juvenile justice, reform, and gradually built a reputation as a brilliant legal mind with an unshakable commitment to children's rights. When she passed the bar exam at 20, 2 breaking records for the youngest attorney, admitted to practice in Illinois, the same newspapers that had covered her childhood ordeal ran stories about her transformation from defendant to defender. Dr. Thompson, now retired, but still her closest advisor, often marveled at how the traumatized child he had first met in detention had become this poised, powerful young woman. But Grace never forgot that her power came not from forgetting her past, but from transforming it into purpose. The culmination of Grace's journey arrived on a crisp spring morning when she stood before the Illinois General Assembly preparing to present legislation that would forever change how the system treated children like herself. The bill, officially titled the Educational Protection and Child Advocacy Act, but known informally as the Grace Act, would make it illegal to criminally prosecute minors for academic disputes without clear evidence of actual criminal intent. It would require mandatory bias training for educators and establish oversight committees to prevent the weaponization of the justice system against gifted children from marginalized communities. As Grace approached the podium, she could see familiar faces in the gallery. Dr. Thompson, now gray-haired but beaming with pride, her grandmother Dorothy, wearing her best dress and clutching a handkerchief, Miss Chen, who had become a principal herself, and was now an advocate for gifted education. The irony was not lost on Grace that she now stood in a position of power addressing the very system that had once tried to destroy her. When she began to speak, her voice carried the authority of lived experience and the weight of legal expertise, each word carefully chosen to honor both the pain of her past and the hope of her future. Every child deserves to be seen for who they are, not who we fear they might be. She concluded, her eyes scanning the assembly with quiet intensity. This bill is not about my story. It's about ensuring that no child's story has to be like mine. The passage of the Grace Act marked the end of one chapter in Grace's life and the beginning of another. As she walked out of the State House that day, surrounded by supporters and journalists, she felt the weight of a different kind of history settling on her shoulders. A young girl approached her in the crowd, maybe 8 or 9 years old, clutching a math workbook and looking up at Grace with wide, admiring eyes. "Are you the lady who loves math?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Grace knelt down to meet her at eye level, seeing in this child's face the same curiosity and intelligence that had once been mistaken for deception. "I am," Grace replied, her smile warm and genuine, "and I bet you love it too." The girl nodded eagerly, and Grace felt the circle completing itself. The trauma transformed into triumph, the pain alchemized into protection for others. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and turned it into the best thing she could do for the world. The 11-year-old girl who had been failed by every adult in her life had grown into a woman who would spend her career ensuring that failure never happened again. In that moment, standing in the spring sunshine with a child's trust reflecting back at her, Grace understood that her story was not about what had been done to her, but about what she had chosen to do with it. The legacy of Grace's transformation extends far beyond the courtroom where her ordeal began. Today, the Grace Act serves as a model for child protection legislation across the country, and Grace herself has become a leading voice in juvenile justice reform. She established the Grace Foundation, which provides legal advocacy for gifted children from underserved communities, and has argued several landmark cases before the Supreme Court. Her journey reminds us that our greatest trials can become our most powerful tools for change, that the systems that seek to diminish us can be transformed by our refusal to be diminished. Grace Daniels proved that a child's dreams are stronger than adult prejudices, that intelligence cannot be handcuffed, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice preparing to be more powerful than anyone imagined. You are amazing. If you genuinely enjoyed this story, please leave a like and subscribe. It's a great feedback for me. If it made you feel seen, heard, or simply reminded you that change is still possible, share it with someone who needs a little hope today. See you.